Yeah.
Questions you got?
So I'm going to reiterate, what triggered this. I'm going to start there. We are trying to accomplish several things here during my tenure. One of those things is to decrease the rate of suicide. That's one of the goals. The other one is to close Ash Street Jail. Now, if you say, how did those two things, how did those goals trigger this? What was the trigger? One of the things we had to do to decrease suicide is actually take inmates and put the new admissions, the people that just got here, put them in a more communal setting. And so we had to move in the new admits from one housing unit that was single cells and double cells, which is a risk factor for people who are, who are new admissions here, because they're new here, they are uncertain about what's going to happen. They've never been arrested before. It's a serious charge. These are risk factors for suicide. They think their life is over. And so we had to change the housing unit around. So when the process of moving those around, we had actually, starting on Tuesday, been moving several housing units around. This most recent housing unit, this one was, it was called GB. And that was the one that we're going to see pictures of right now. We also were going to be moving GA. GB and GA, so as I said before, these are people who are awaiting trial, and they were also people who were, really, they were tough inmates. These were not people who would be in there for like pre-release or anything. We had some people in GB who were awaiting trial for multiple murder charges, a lot of recidivists. It was a tough group to begin with. So when they got word on Thursday that they were going to be moved on Friday to a different housing unit, we have the video footage of this too. They already started talking amongst themselves the night before to push back. They didn't want to change the housing unit because they knew where they were going was going to be a housing unit that had locked doors. So they started talking amongst themselves, and we learned this afterwards reviewing the footage. So they protested, and they, I don't call this a riot though. A riot by definition is violent. There was really no violence. This was destructive, but it wasn't violent. Nobody got hurt, COs or, the inmates, and that was one of the two main goals that I had. The first one was to de-escalate the situation. The second one was that nobody gets hurt. I guess the third goal would have been to take back the housing unit, in which we accomplished those second and third objectives. So that was one thing, is that we had to, move inmates into housing units that are communal settings, so that way we have more eyes on new admissions. The second goal was, and we were going to be doing GA and GB, we want to put toilets in cells, because when you can put a toilet in a cell, then you can lock the door. In roughly half the cells here in BC, in the Sheriff's Office, they don't lock. We have 11 housing units. I'm not sure out of how many, but we have a total of 11 that don't have locks on the doors because there's no toilets in cells. We have 7 here, and then we have 4 at the Women's Center. The 4 housing units at the Women's Center, none of them have locks on doors. So as we were doing these two different things, we're putting, we're making it more suicide resistant, and by, putting inmates into a communal setting, the new admits, but then we're also taking on the different housing units, putting locks on doors, and at the same time we're putting the locks on doors, the maintenance crew are going to go through and make the beds more suicide resistant, and we just talked about that on April 14th. We showed there was a prototype for that. So those are the two reasons that we were shuffling inmates around. We wanted to put toilets in cells, locks on doors, new suicide-resistant beds, put the new admits into places, so that some inmates got in their head they wanted to stay right where they were, and it doesn't work like that. The response that was from them was, even before the COs, there were 4 COs in the housing unit at the time. At some point in the future, the footage will be released where the COs acted very quickly. It could have become a hostage situation, it could have, but there's a red button on a control panel, which we'll show you in one of these pictures. In fact, we're going to also turn off one of those lights, so we'll see this better. But when we show you the pictures, though, you'll see there's a red button. The COs hit the button, back themselves out, and lock themselves in. And what that button did was it deactivated the whole control panel. Had the COs not acted quickly and deactivated the control panel, 75 inmates from GB could have gone out into the courtyard, which is the aerial footage you saw from the helicopters. They could have gotten out there, and they could have also gotten on the roof. And so if the inmates hadn't been all contained, and then we got our large response of over 100 security officers from other parts of the state, if it was just our staff dealing with that when it first was going down at 9 o'clock, people would have gotten hurt. So the COs shutting things down, backing out, and saying, just, you know, cordoning off that housing unit, that kept us from having a true riot. You know, so otherwise this was just damage. It was a lot of damage, not to minimize it, but it was, I can't thank them enough for responding, you know, exactly the way they should have to prevent what happened from getting worse. So the next thing is, you know, I was called down and made it clear, no dogs. We didn't want dogs. That was the difference with how things were handled in the past. I didn't want the dogs present for a number of reasons. The first one is when the public sees dogs, they think, what do dogs do? They bite. Dogs are going to bite. We're not going to be using dogs for biting. We're using dogs for detecting drugs. We're using dogs for helping police departments find somebody. We're not using dogs to bite. So the optic of that was terrible. I didn't want that to be part of, you know, the image of this day. Another reason, a more practical reason, is when dogs are present, they're barking. Okay, so and that's just, and people can't hear when orders are being given, so we wanted to do dogs differently too. Like if you look at what happened in May of 2020 with the ICE detention center, dogs were present. The dogs aren't doing anything other than being a distraction, they're making noise, and so that, you know, wanted to make sure that we had calm. That was one of the goals. Try and de-escalate it. The dogs wouldn't help. That would only escalate the situation. So during the time we were waiting for security teams to arrive, we had 5 different sheriff's offices send their special response team. We had, as I said before, Suffolk, Hampden, Norfolk, Barnstable, and Plymouth counties. So I'd like to thank all the special response teams, the COs that came out from them. Also the Massachusetts Department of Correction, they were sent as well, quite a number of people. Once we had the right size group of security officers to respond, we were able to go to the housing unit, and once the inmates saw that we had well over 100 correctional staff, and during this time we were trying to de-escalate them, trying to talk them down, tell them we don't want anybody to get hurt. People could get hurt if you don't cooperate with us. We want you to cooperate, we want you to go back to your cells. And so we were messaging to the inmates all day, we don't want anybody to get hurt. And by holding off, by being patient, if we had just gone in with the probably 20 to 30 security SRTs, a special response team, people would have gotten hurt. If we had just gone in with just the people here, we would have been outnumbered, and that would have had to result in more force being used to subdue 75 inmates. Because when you are trying to subdue 70 and get 75 inmates to cooperate, when you've got lesser numbers, you're going to have to probably use force. Yes?
You said you were messaging the inmates. Was it sending a message by not sending the dogs, or were you otherwise?
Several. So literally sending message. So we actually had a lieutenant, we had a colonel, we had a captain that were talking to the inmates through the windows, and because some of these windows open, and so we're telling them, please go back to your cells. We want to, get back in there. We want to just, take back the housing unit. And, I will be cautious with my words because I don't want to compare the inmates to children. But everybody here knows when some kids are having like a meltdown, and they get to the point, they're overtired, and they get to the point of no return, and you just can't reason with the child. I'm not calling the inmates children, but it got to that same level of point of no return, and we couldn't reason with them anymore. They were just completely adamant. They were digging their heels in, and so they gave us a list of demands. Some of the demands were reasonable: better grievance process, better or more available reentry programming. And I told them these are some of the things, lower canteen prices. I told them these are things I campaigned on. These are things I'm going to be working on. Some of the demands were to speak to me right away. That wasn't going to happen. If I'd made myself available to them, that probably would have escalated them even more. And the only reason somebody in my situation would actually put themselves there is they think they have an ego big enough to de-escalate a situation that's already out of control. No. If me presenting myself would not have calmed it, it would have probably escalated things. But I wrote back So, one of the lieutenant handed that letter to them they didn't even read it. They took it, tore it up, threw it back at us, and that was the end of that. And we knew, and this was around 2 o'clock or so was when that happened. So at this point where, the security staff were arriving in the dozens, and we had well over probably 120, 130 security staff from all over the state. DOC sent, I think, 70. The different sheriff's offices sent anywhere from 10 to 30 each, depending on the sheriff's office. And so that's when we took the commanders of all the different security response units. We brought them inside the special investigation unit. We looked at the video footage. We showed them what it looked like inside the housing unit before the cameras were all destroyed, and then once they had a look at what it looks like. And you'll see some of the things we'll show you. There's some water on the floor. A lot of what they did was they took soapy water, threw that on the floor, made it really slippery. They took a lot of beds, mattresses, furniture. They barricaded themselves in. Fortunately, the doors were designed to open inwards, because if we had to push the doors open, we wouldn't have been able to get in. But fortunately, they opened in, so we could actually get inside. They had destroyed a lot of property, and they made a lot of weapons, which we're going to show you in the pictures. And but once we showed them what that looked like on camera, then we brought the commanders of the different, like the DOC and the 5 jails plus our jail, over to an identical housing unit that was vacant, that was empty. And they said, okay, this is the lay of the land. And so that's when they said, okay, now it's time to go take back the housing unit. I made it clear that, the public is watching. I said, be judicious with your use of force. I said, we're going to show force. We're going to show up with over 100 security staff. We showed force by using CS gas and flashbangs, and that disorientated the inmates so that they could enter, the COs and security staff could enter and get past the barricades. And, but once inside, the inmates basically succumbed to, and they got down, they were handcuffed, they were brought out one by one, but for one person who resisted and wasn't hurt in that resistance. Neither the COs or the inmate was hurt when that one inmate resisted. There were no injuries. Nobody had to go to the hospital. Some people were sent to the medical unit just to be checked up on different things, but generally speaking, there were nobody was injured.